Story Time with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, I am Stephanie Storey, and this is Story Time. I have to say I'm very excited about my guest today because I brought him here specifically to help me with one of my crazy obsessions, which is trying to understand how our greatest artists in the world, painters, sculptors, but also musicians and actors and filmmakers, the people who really make life-changing, world-changing, history-changing art do it. That's my personal obsession. And I'm pretty sure my guest today may have some insight on one of the ingredients that might go into being really successful in what you do. So he is the author of Igniting the Invisible Tribe. He has a great TEDx talk called How Work Can Heal the World. You should check that out. It's fantastic. He is also the CEO of a company called Helios, which is dedicated to helping everybody in the world love their work. It's a very lofty goal, my friend. Welcome to the show, Josh Dykstra.
Thank you, Steph. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining me. So I don't know if you know this. I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for a very long time, and we never have gotten to have this conversation. So when I started the show, I thought, I'm just going to do it on camera in case it helps other people learn what makes the great artists of the world tick and maybe can help people figure themselves out a little bit. So before I start with my real first question, can you tell my audience at home why you are so passionate about getting people to learn to love work?
Yeah, because it is a bit of a crazy goal, right? When you think about it, it's a pretty lofty thing to say, yeah, everybody in the world should love their work. And I think from our perspective, it's actually the most reasonable path forward, because right now what's happening is the vast majority of people don't love their work. Like, statistically, Deloitte tells us over 87% of people cannot say they're passionate about this thing that they spend the majority of their life doing. Right? Almost 90% of people can fit into this category of not loving work. And so from our perspective, the only sane path forward, if we're actually going to spend the majority of our waking lives in pursuit of this thing called work, the only reasonable response is actually to flip that number around and help people actually enjoy this thing that they spend so much of their time and energy and focus around. I mean, work defines us in so many ways, right? It decides kind of where we live and who we see the most, and the friends we have, and where we can travel, or if we can travel. And in the US, it tells us if we can have healthcare or not, right? It's such a defining thing in our lives. And so for us, the only crazy thing is that we actually have not set it up to enjoy it.
What do you think it does for people? I mean, because we spend 8-10 hours of our day, depending on the job we have, 5-7 days a week, again, depending on the job we have. What do you think it does for people and their engagement at the job, or how well they do their job? Because since I'm particularly interested in the upper echelon of people, does it improve the way people do their jobs, or does it just make them happier?
Yeah. Like if they love their work.
Yeah.
So that's the other kind of, win-win to this whole argument, is that for many years, and I thought this way too, that there's a, kind of a trade-off, right? It's like, well, that would be nice if you could love your work, but we need to get, stuff done. But it turns out that it's actually the opposite. So the more we study this, the more we realize that people who are actually in a state of enjoyment of their work, they achieve so much more. So there's a couple studies that I'll point you to. One is one around the topic of flow, right? So some people might be familiar with this idea, and you're all actually familiar with this idea, even if you don't know that term, because all it means is being in the zone. Right?
Like on the tennis court when I hit the ball really well.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. When you're in the zone, right? Or when you're writing probably sometimes, right? Steph, you get in the zone and you look up and it's been 4 hours and you haven't eaten. And it's like you were so focused and kind of in that moment where time just kind of flew by, but it also was kind of standing still. We like to call it being in the zone. It's when we see people doing these kind of amazing feats of whatever, right? So we see this a lot in musicians and in artists and surfers and Olympians, right? we see a lot of places. The place we don't see it though is usually work for most people. We see it out there a lot. So we recognize it. We love to watch it, but we don't see it at the workplace. But what happens when we ask people inside the workplace, McKinsey did this study a few years ago, and they asked senior executives, how much more productive do you feel like you are when you're in your zone? The most common answer was 5 times. I feel like I get 5 times more done when I'm in my zone. And so if you extrapolate that data across an organization, what happens is that if you could increase a person's time, like everybody like in your organization, if you can increase their time in flow by 20%, right? So just 1/5 more. So not just, this isn't crazy, but just a little more time spent in your zone, you double the productivity of your organization.
That's interesting because it makes me think of like Rembrandt famously just created picture after picture after picture. Now he had a whole workshop doing it as well, but he's famous for just creating this flood of pictures. We don't even know how many were really his and how many were just in his workshop. It was just these hundreds and thousands of pictures that he painted during his lifetime. And I keep thinking, you wouldn't have done that if you didn't really want to be there and really love what you were doing. So my question is it possible to achieve real greatness if you don't love what you're doing? Like, have you seen instances of that? I don't see much of it, but I'm open that you technically could be able to.
Yeah, I'd be open to it too. In theory, I don't see it happen though in practice either, right? Like there always seems to be a component of enjoyment in this state of flow, right? That there's a level of challenge to it, but I kind of like that too if it's in my area that I really like, right? So that's when I actually like the challenge enough to push myself to the edge or a little beyond, right? Which is when greatness happens, right? So yeah, we like to say that it's actually impossible for human beings to achieve, especially sustained bouts of excellence, if they don't tap into this kind of zone of high intensity energy.
I was having a conversation with a different author the other day, and he's a space writer, and he interviews and he talks to and he writes biographies of astronauts, right? And I asked him this. I said, these astronauts who are at the peak of their career, did they love the space? Did they love space flight? He said no. They were at the right place at the right time. But then he followed it up with, but it's not like they were sitting on their couch. They were out pushing themselves. They were out.
Right.
I was like, well, that means they loved something about it, right? Even if it wasn't the idea of space.
Well, I think that's where we would like to go in our work. So what's kind of the energy undercurrent underneath the activity, I think is a much more interesting question. It's a much more helpful question, because then it's like, why are these people astronauts in the first place, right? Like something about it caused them to push themselves, and it might be slightly different thing for all of them, but there's some sort of drive underneath there that kind of puts them in that state of feeling energized by it. And the question is, what is that?
This whole conversation reminds me of, when Michelangelo, I'm a little obsessed with the guy, right? When he starts painting, when he starts painting the Sistine ceiling, he hates it. Like he hates to paint. He's griping about it. He just wants to go back and carve marble. Now, obviously, at some point, that attitude changes because he throws out easy designs and he makes the job more complicated. He makes the job last longer. He ends up putting a masterpiece on the ceiling. I don't think anybody thinks you put something like that up on the ceiling and you hate putting every stroke of paint on it. Like that's loony. And so he obviously changed his mind in the middle of this enormous project about how he felt about it. And I guess I'm trying to understand how a person could do that, face this big, huge project, just a human being in general, whether it's a project at work or an art project or whatever it is, how you can change your attitude about it so much from, I hate this, I don't want to do it, I can't do any of this, to I'm going to put the greatest thing ever created on a ceiling, put on a ceiling.
Right. I'm just going to do that real quick. Yeah.
Sure. No big deal.
Right. Yeah.
Have you seen people who've sort of changed in the middle of projects? Really? How?
Oh, totally. No, I think this is a big part of the work we do, actually, because it's just a reframing technique. It's like a mental hack, right? So as you give people tools to kind of understand these underlying energizers, this is often what we the way we help people start to reframe their jobs, right? So whether it's, painting a ceiling or whether it's whatever it is that you do, the way you go about it makes a huge difference, right? The way that I approach it. So my guess is that something in there, right? He was able to flip his mindset to approach it through a different lens, right? And so the classic example that I give on this is, your commute. And of course, nobody's really doing that right now, but like your typical work commute, right? Let's say I used to live in, we both used to live in Los Angeles, right? So we spent way too much time in the car when you live in that city. And I hate it, right? And being in traffic just particularly drives me crazy. It feels like a waste of my time. And so what do? I might have to do it, right? To get to see a client or get to a talk or whatever. So I sometimes have to be in the traffic. What do? I think about it differently. So what I can do is I love learning. And so I can put on a podcast, right? And I turn this time inside the car into a learning experience for myself.
Right.
And the whole experience is different for me, right? I'm not thinking about it through the lens of, oh, this is a waste of my life. I'm thinking about it as an opportunity to learn something, right? So it's a simple kind of, mind hack trick. It's just a reframe. But I think when you know what gives you energy, it's easier for you to do that, because I can start to say, oh, is there a way for me to turn this into a learning opportunity? Because then I'd probably like it better. So my curiosity is like, what switch must have he flipped in his mind to say, like, tap into something underneath that was interesting? And maybe it's the additional challenge of it, right? Like you expanded the scope and all of a sudden it was interesting, or I don't know.
I think it was probably the figures. He put figure, suddenly he put the human figure at a forefront in an interesting way, started playing with perspective, started making the figures more sculptural, started learning, I think, to your point, I think he was also really focused on learning throughout his life.
Sure.
Started learning a little bit more about how to create a human figure in 2D versus 3D. But
Right.
but I bet
There's
it's something like that.
Yeah, that reframe, right? It can take the same mundane, boring, draining activity and turn it into something that I actually have quite a bit of appetite for.
Okay, this is another question that I thought of as far as artists go. There's this belief that artists can only create when they're struggling, or like great art comes from pain or angst or whatever. And so then I've been around artists who've been worried about getting over their angst and trouble and crazy mindsets because they're afraid they're not going to be creative anymore.
Right.
Raphael is the exact opposite, right? He approached life from this place of joy. So he is the exception that proves the rule, right? But I can't understand that, like, Vincent van Gogh really was sort of a miserable guy, and that's where a lot of his art came from. Michelangelo was a tempestuous grump. I mean, he was awful. And maybe that's where some of the beauty came from.
Yeah, I'm going back to our conversation about flow though too, and I'm trying to think if the evidence of, greatness in an area that really does, somehow like interest me and energize me, kind of trumps this other, like if there's even in this time of feeling tortured, right? Is there something in there that still kind of puts me in a flow state, right? And this is actually one of the things I was excited to talk with you about, Steph, because I think the word passion itself is a little bit of a dangerous frame.
Okay, tell me.
Because I think it's a little bit flighty, like in the language and the framing, like it feels like I'm at the whims, like the way we often use it, right, is to kind of describe all the whims of passion. I got kind of caught up in this kind of, and it's in a very emotive, it's a very reactionary kind of way that we talk about passion. Now, of course, the actual definition of passion means suffering. Right. So you go back to like Passion of the Christ, right? Like thinking about that, like there's a real connection here to passion and suffering, which may also connect to this question that you're talking about, that in the pursuit of something that actually brings us life and energy, that one of the main components of flow is challenge, but you don't actually get to a state of flow without it. So without some suffering, there's no flow, right? So that may be where these things come together, is that, yeah, there's an element of, we torture ourselves to get better and to push ourselves to the edge and to like, but a lot of that I think can be craft based and doesn't have to be like, you know, situational, like, or like mental, or, you know, I think it can be focused on the discipline of, you know, pushing ourselves to make, which is maybe like, again, Michelangelo on the ceiling, right? What he may have done there is pushed himself out of his comfort zone. And that may
Right.
have been the exact, you know, suffering kind of passion that allowed him to keep going.
Speaking about challenge and work though, and you brought up the current pandemic and quarantine we're living under and all of that. That is an enormous challenge. So many people are
Yeah.
working at home for the first time, and I mean, talk about suffering and talk about having to have passion for your work in order to still do it and not get freaking distracted by the global pandemic out our doors. Any advice for people at home going through this crazy quarantine if they already hated their jobs and now they got to do
Well, this is actually more my suspicion of what's going on, right? This situation is unearthing all of the cracks that were already there before. And it's made them really visible, right? Like this has just made all of that stuff that we didn't like before, that wasn't aligned with our wiring or the way that we want to be in the world. All of that stuff is now like kind of out in the open because we're being forced to face it in a really tangible way, right? So to your point, if I didn't like my job before, maybe there was parts that I kind of did because I could go to the office and see some of my friends and, you know, get some camaraderie and like hang out and go to happy hour. And, you know, or like there were maybe parts of my job that made it palatable. And now I have none of those things. Now it's just the work. But yeah, for people who are maybe feeling that way, this could be a really great time to devote a little bit of energy towards some reflection, to try to say what does energize you. And this is a frame that I think most of us can lean into because we've not really been taught to think this way, right? And the way that work has been structured, no matter what kind of work you do, for the most part, the question isn't does it energize you? The question is, you know, can you do more? Like, can you do it faster? Like that. That's the question. So it's not like, yeah, do you like it? It's like you were hired for a job and freaking do it. And so in this moment, and we like to look at this as a moment of reinvention, right? The whole world is disoriented. We will not be the same coming out of this. So let's look at this as a time of reinvention. And what are the things that you personally would like to reinvent as we all kind of come out this on the other side? And I would say, please look at just start to keep track. And a simple way to do this is to just have a piece of paper, put a line down like a vertical line down the center, and have two columns. On the left-hand side, right, you know, energizing, and the right-hand side, put draining. And just start doing a little journal, like keeping track of the activities throughout your day. You say, man, that was energizing for me when I got to have that specific call, you know, when I got to talk to Steph. That was really fun. And, you know, but when I had to get into those details, right, of, you know, whatever I had to do, like, you know, I had to scan all the receipts that I had to do to submit my expenses, like that just about killed me. Right. So eventually, though, you do this for even a couple of weeks, you'll start to see some patterns, and you'll start to be able to say, these things in the energizing column, how do I do more of that? So when we all kind of come back, what if we all tried to do a little bit more of what was in our energizing column and a little bit less of what's in the draining column? We'd all go back to work in a slightly healthier way, I think.
Yeah, maybe some of that stuff will stick. Maybe when we get to the other side, we'll see a bright spot. I hope that when we get to the other side, something positive pays out.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that depends on what we choose to do with it now. You know,
right.
So yeah, we're all creating the future as it will be, and so yeah, it depends a lot on how we choose to see this situation. So,
I like that. We're all creating the future. So picture it well.
Yeah.
You know, put a little beauty and little goodness out into the world.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, so much for joining me.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories.